Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Mental Health and Wellbeing Global Summit. And it is my great honor to be here with Tara Brach. Tara's teachings blend Western psychology and Eastern spiritual practices, mindful attention to our inner life, and a full, compassionate engagement with our world. The result is a distinctive voice in Western Buddhism, one that offers a wise and caring approach to freeing ourselves and society from suffering. Tara has a PhD in clinical psychology. She's founder of the Insight Meditation Community of Washington, D.C. And along with Jack Kornfield, she leads the Mindfulness Meditation Teacher Certification Program, serving participants from over 75 countries around the world. Her podcast has been downloaded 3 million times every month, and she's the author of the books Radical Acceptance, Radical Compassion, and Trusting the Gold. And I told Tara when I started this interview that her voice has almost been internalized into my healthy mind after listening to so many meditations on Insight Timer and attending some of her online sagas. Tara, it's just great to have you here.
Oh, Kasi, thank you for that sweet welcome. And wow, namaste, friends. Blessings. Just glad to be with all of you. So I'm going to be exploring with you a meditation I love. It's a weave of mindfulness and compassion. And it's been applied clinically by really big numbers of mental health professionals internationally. And this practice, it's called the rain meditation, helps process difficult emotions, like fear and anger and shame in a way that both relieves suffering, but also really invites a deep spiritual awakening, a real enlarging of a sense of our being, from a small sense of me to we, to really the field of awareness, much more open-heartedness. And that feels really important in our divided world. So, as you know, meditation's increasingly popular. And as with everything, our Western culture has stamped it in its own particular way. I remember seeing a cartoon with these monks on the DC Mall demonstrating, and the leader's yelling through his megaphone, what do we want? And everybody's responding, mindfulness, mindfulness. When do we want it? Now. So it's so in our culture we bring our neurosis and impatience even to spiritual practice. I want to see results. I want to get somewhere quickly. And paradoxically, the ground of meditation is presence. I think of the Dalai Lama, it's about a decade or so ago, being interviewed. He had just written a book on happiness. And the reviewer said, what was the happiest moment of your life? And he thought for a moment, and he said, I think now. And it's so true. Our world is so thirsty for pathways of healing, pathways of presence, both individually and collectively. If I had to name a key element of what's most needed, it's intentionally evolving our capacity for compassion, for our inner life, compassion for each other, for our living world, really shifting from me to we. Because we know it's only by growing compassion that we can bridge the divides, the political, racial, gender, the divides with other species, really the dividedness with the living web. It threatens life everywhere, that dividedness. So we need to wake up out of othering, and come to see the sacredness of life everywhere, which is why I want to explore this meditation. So it's based on an acronym. RAIN is an acronym for recognize, allow, investigate, and nurture. And countless people have told me, in emails, especially through these times of pandemic, of polycrisis, that RAIN saved their life. that it really healed the inner and relational divides. I thought I'd start in personally with what motivated me to write Radical Compassion, which is a guidebook on rain, and teach it so regularly. And that was that some years back, my mom moved down here to live with my husband, Jonathan, and myself. And it was a really busy, pressured time. And I kept finding myself caught between feeling guilty, shortchanging my time with her, and very anxious about getting things done. And I felt increasingly divided, from myself and from her. So I started practicing rain, applying it to this. And I'd pause when I could, and the R recognize, I'd say, okay, anxious, anxious. And the allowing is like saying, okay, just let it be there for a moment. Don't try to fix it or ignore it or get rid of it. So I'd allow that anxiety, and then I'd investigate, what am I believing? Well, I'm believing I'm going to fall short, that I'm going to fail, that I'm going to lose love of the world because I fail. And, with that, and investigate, by the way, is primarily somatic. Please note that. I'd feel this clenching in my chest, this real squeezing. And so then I'd, just ask, okay, so what really do I need right now? I put my hand on my heart. That's the beginning of nurturing, the end of rain. Well, what I need is really to trust, my goodness, to trust I love my mother, to trust that I'll serve as well as I can in my work. Just trust. And so I sent that message to myself. That's nurturing. And then I call this after the rain. This is really the fruit. I just felt more spacious. I could feel a little bit of the currents of anxiety, but the what I was kind of enlarged, just resting in this field of kindness. And I did this a handful of times, and I started finding that when I was with my mom, I could really show up and just be there with her. Whether we were eating our big salads in the evening or walking on the river, going to a medical appointment, I was there with her. She died a few years later. And even as I say, I can feel the grief of it, but there were no regrets because rain had saved my life moments with my mom. The gift of rain is, and this is really the gift of mindfulness and compassion, is that it allows a shift from a small self, for me, the anxious self or the guilty self, to a larger sense of being, to a kind of awake heart space. And there's a wonderful image that points to this shift. And it comes from a story about a gigantic statue of the Buddha, a true story, a statue in Thailand. And it wasn't the most beautiful kind of statue. It was just this huge, plaster clay statue, but people were very devoted to it, and it had been around for centuries. It had survived through storms and through battles and through different rulers. Well, in the 1950s, there was a long dry season, and cracks started appearing. And one enterprising monk took a little flashlight and shined it into the crack. And what shined back was the gleam of gold. He looked in another crack and another. And then they ended up taking what turned out to be just the covering of plaster and clay. And it turned out to be, and is, the largest solid gold statue of the Buddha in Southeast Asia. And what's interesting to me is that the monks say that the statue was covered to protect it during challenging, threatening times, much in the same way that we cover over our innate goodness, our innocence, our purity, as we move through a difficult world. And the suffering is that we get identified with the coverings, with our egoic beliefs and defenses and strategies and so on, controlling things, we forget who's looking through the mask. We forget that awakeness and that tender heart that's here. And this forgetting is what I call a trance, sometimes thought of as a dream. We live in a narrowed kind of reality with limiting beliefs about who we are. And I think of the whole of healing and spiritual awakening as waking up from that trance, from that illusion of a small self, to realize the mystery and beauty and love of really our vastness. So I'm going to speak just a couple minutes more about trance, because this is what we're waking up from. And there are really three, maybe there's probably more, but there's three big flags of trance when we can kind of catch ourselves. And one is when we find ourselves, as I did, with this kind of anxious, obsessive thinking of, am I going to get enough done, and what's going to happen if I don't, and so on. I often think of the story of the text that a mom sends to her son, and it says, "Start worrying, details to follow." And it's like that. We're just churning and churning because in some way we think it'll protect us from things going wrong. The second flag is blaming others, is that kind of conflict with others where when life's not going our way, when we don't feel secure, making others less or wrong, blaming. I think of a woman in a job interview I heard about, and the interviewer says, "Well, tell me, what do you think your biggest character defect is?" And her reply, "Honesty." He says, "Honesty? I wouldn't consider honesty a defect." Her reply, "I don't care what the hell you think." And it's a silly example, but when we get hijacked, it happens quickly. And we often say things that we regret. And it often has to do with putting somebody down, making a distance. And often it happens when people don't agree with us. There's that saying, the world is divided into those who think they're right. And that's the whole saying. So we get at odds with other people. That's a sign of trance, that we've contracted into a smaller sense of self and we're living on the coverings. We're forgetting the gold. Okay. The third one, and this is pervasive, is turning against ourselves. In some way feeling like we're bad or less than. It's that covering of self-aversion. And it can be a kind of chronic background to everything else, that sense of, I'm falling short. I'm not enough. And as you're listening, you might sense, is that a trance you live in very much? I often think of a cartoon where a dog is saying, it's always good dog this and good dog that, but is it ever great dog? And it's like that. And sometimes it's really acute, a real deep sense of being flawed. And I call this particular trance the trance of unworthiness. And my book, Radical Acceptance, was really all about how deep a trance it is. I mean, if I asked you if we were live and I said, how many of you think you judge yourself too much? Most of us would raise our hand, but we don't always recognize how that undercurrent of not okay keeps us from enjoying the moment. It keeps us from really being intimate with others. It keeps us from taking risks, from being creative. I always think that the most fundamental truths are the ones we most forget. And one of them is that we can't be happy. We can't really fully care about and love life if we're turned against ourselves. So this is the trance. This is living on the coverings. One woman, when she was with her mother at her mother's deathbed, mother was coming in and out of a coma. And the last time she came out of a coma, she actually looked very lucidly at her daughter and said, all my life, I thought something was wrong with me. And those were her last words. And for her daughter, it was kind of a wake up at how these feelings of unworthiness can impact our whole life. We can be living on the coverings and forget the gold for decades and decades. Our contemporary society reinforces the trance of unworthiness, that sense of something's wrong. There's just very little innate sense of belonging to the earth, to family, to community, just to help us reconnect to wholeness. There's so much competition. We're each handed standards for how we should be, to be accepted and loved. A certain kind of personality, a certain kind of looks, a certain kind of body, a certain kind of intelligence. I think of in education, how the main intelligence that's valued is kind of a left brain intelligence, and how many of our children feel less than. The most toxic amplification of that trance of unworthiness that drives people to live in the covering and forget the gold comes from institutionalized violence against non-dominant culture. I mean, you can see it in the United States racial caste system so glaringly. I think of Toni Morrison, who wrote that in this country, being American means being white. Everyone else has to hyphenate. So society's basic message to those who are considered non-dominant is you're inferior. Your life is not as valuable. We forget the sacredness. Okay, friends, so let's look at how rain can wake us up from the trance, can help us remember the gold, can kind of help bridge the divides. And I'm going to just share a couple of examples and then we'll practice together. Okay. And the first example I thought I'd share is many years ago, I worked with a woman who was executive, and her work was very central to her life. And she was very upset because her teenage daughter was now a high school senior. Her grades were tanking. She was smoking a lot of pot. There was an angry kind of distance between them. And this mom felt responsible because of her work and not attending enough. And she was angry at her daughter for the ways her daughter was behaving. So we did rain together. And the R of rain, recognize, was she started with anger. Because you start with recognize whatever's predominant. There was a number of feelings, but anger was the predominant feeling. The A, allow. I sometimes think of allow like whatever's coming up is a wave in the ocean and it belongs there. So the A is like saying, okay, for now, this belongs, let it be. So she just let it be for a bit. And then we began to investigate and to feel in her body that as she opened to that anger, really opened to it and contacted the grip of it, she could feel under it fear. And then if she kept opening to the fear, she could feel a real deep sense of shame that it's my fault. This feeling of I'm failing her. And when I asked her how familiar that feeling was, she said, all my life, I've felt like I was failing in some way. And that was what I sometimes call an ouch moment, where she was really in the suffering. And there was a wave of sorrow, a kind of soul sadness that comes when we see the landscape of how many years we've been stuck in that trance, that we've been caught in the coverings, how much life was lost while she was at war with herself. So I asked her what that place in her needed, that place that was so sad and feeling so much loss. And it needed for her to know that she was doing her best. In a way, a lot like that message I had to give myself, just to trust that she loved her daughter, trust her heart. And so I guided her to put her hand on her heart. And I often do this because there's a real power to establishing that kind of nurturing connection inwardly. And it's a gentle touch. And she sent that message to herself. You have a loving heart. Trust it. After the 4 steps of rain comes what I call after the rain. And it's important not to miss after the rain, because this is just like with a real rain. After a real rain comes down, you see the fruits afterwards with things blossoming. Well, I invited her during after the rain just to pause and sense the quality of presence that was there. And she could sense a lot more space, a lot more compassion for herself, for her daughter. And as she did it, she repeated this process a number of times. She increasingly sensed that me to we, that she and her daughter and all of us were in it together. And she could increasingly see her daughter more clearly with some empathy, her daughter's fears, her daughter's concerns about leaving home and who she was going to be. She just could see it. And she started to create a much safer space for her daughter to express and talk to her. And there was a lot more connection possible. Because here's what happens. When we do rain, we widen our sense of who we are. We enlarge. And in that spacious, compassionate field, there's a lot more clarity about what's going on for others. There's a lot more natural compassion. But we need to practice, because it's so quick when we get triggered to contract away from that field where we see the gold in ourselves and each other and get back onto the coverings. And when we're on the coverings, we see only our own ego and others' egos. We forget the sacred that's living through them. Give you one more example of this, that this many, many years ago, heard this story about a lieutenant in the Army, and he had problems with his anger. And so he got sent to an anger management training. He still had to take it. And it's centered really on mindfulness and self-compassion, much as we're exploring today. And so one day, he, at the end of the day, went to a supermarket, and he still had a lot to do at home. So he was in a hurry, and he filled his cart, got into line. The woman in front of him only had 2 items in her cart, and she had a little girl. And so she handed the little girl to the clerk, and they're oohing and eyeing over the little girl. And he's thinking, I'm a busy guy. She's in the wrong lane. She should be in the other lane over there for 2 items. And now they're just, being, all silly over a little child. And he went from impatience to feeling like he was going to explode with anger. And then he reminded himself, pause, mindfulness. So he did this kind of practice where he just recognized he was angry, and he just let it be there and opened and felt what was there. And he could feel the fear underneath. I'm not going to get everything done. My life's going to crash. We all know that one. And he just very gently said, it's okay. It's okay. Calmed himself down. And there was more openness. And when he looked up, he saw that the little girl was really cute. So the woman in front of him left. It was his turn. He said to the clerk, that little girl is adorable. And the clerk beamed, and she said, oh, well, actually, that's my child. My mother brings her here. My husband was killed in Afghanistan last year. So my mom brings her over a couple of times a day, so we have a little time together. I share this with you. It's not everyone we meet has had such a huge loss, but we're all vulnerable, and life is so uncertain. We lose those we love. There's that wonderful, it's anonymous saying, be kind. Everyone you meet, this is including yourself, is fighting a hard battle. Everyone's living with vulnerability. So what if we could slow down if we could pause when we encounter each other and in some way look deeper and see, oh, it's not me, it's we humans with our vulnerability, and we humans with our intrinsic goodness that we love, that we love to live, to wake up to that we. There's a metaphor that struck me that it informs me so often of walking in the woods and seeing a dog by a tree, and you go to pet the dog and the dog lurches at you and its fangs are bared and it's ferocious, and you go from being friendly to angry and back off, but then you notice that the dog has a paw in a trap. And then you shift again. You might not get close because it's dangerous, but your heart shifts. You see more, you care. And the teaching is that when you or anyone you know is acting in a way that seems harmful, hurtful, their legs in a trap. And we need to know that they may be dangerous. We have to be careful. And we need to know the same thing about ourselves, that we need to do something about ourselves. But there's a kindness, there's a compassion, which is life-changing. So, friends, we suffer when we forget our belonging to ourselves, to each other, to this living world. And mindfulness and compassion, this weave that we're exploring in RAIN, is a pathway back to belonging, a pathway back to caring, to cherishing, to seeing the sacred in life everywhere. Okay, enough words from me on this. Let's practice together. We'll do what I call a light rain, which is, it's not long, but it'll give you a taste. So wherever you are, find a place to sit comfortably. You need to shift your posture a little. You might sit in a way that you're also alert as possible. Take a few moments to settle. It's fine to either close your eyes or have your gaze downcast, whatever is better. You might take a few full breaths to help you arrive right here in this moment, so that you're breathing in and filling the chest and the lungs. And then let the out breath be slow, and just sense a letting go with the out breath. And again, inhaling deeply, filling the chest and the lungs. And a slow out breath. Letting the breath resume in its natural rhythm, sensing the presence that's here, noticing if there's anything that wants to let go a little in your body, any tension you might not have noticed, just let go a little. And then begin to scan your life and sense if there's a place where you get stuck repeatedly in some sort of emotional reactivity. Not something that's traumatizing, but perhaps feeling some anger or fear, self-judgment, might have to do with a relationship, maybe work, maybe there's an addictive behavior, might have to do with finances or health, or maybe your feelings about our larger society, but where you regularly find strong emotions are coming up in a way that maybe brings you off balance, is uncomfortable, difficult, painful. So take some moments to identify a stuck place and go right to a situation, maybe a recent one, that where you were triggered. And as you go to that situation, see if you can visualize it. If you were inside the room you were in, or if you were outside where there's another person involved, seeing their face, the expression of their face, maybe hearing the words that were exchanged. Bring it close in. And as if you're watching a movie, stop right at the part of the film where you feel it's most difficult. Kind of enter it. Just notice what you're fearing or upset about. What's the worst part of this for you? We begin with recognizing what's the most predominant feeling that you're aware of. And you might just mentally whisper the word that comes to mind. It might be fear or anger or hurt or judgment, whatever comes to mind. You can whisper it, just name it. And if there's more than one, that's fine too. And then have the intention of fully letting it be. Just that willingness to pause, to not judge, to not push it away. This belongs. So allowing creates a space to investigate. And primarily we're investigating the felt sense in the body. But you might want to first ask yourself a couple of questions like, what's the worst part of this? What most wants my attention? So that you can then sense and ask, what is it that I'm believing when this is going on? About myself or about this other person. What's the deepest, most core thing I'm believing? Is it that I'm not lovable? I'm not worthy? I can't trust someone? That something bad is about to happen? What am I believing? And with whatever you notice, discover where you feel the strongest vulnerability inside you. Where are the feelings the strongest? Is it your throat, your chest, your belly? As you sense the feelings, sense the emotion, whether it's fear, anger, grief, you might further experiment and take the posture that expresses this. Make the facial expression. So you're really sculpting your body and your face into the feeling. And then go back to where you feel it most in your body with this real willingness. It's kind of courageous just to feel the feelings directly. You might breathe with them. You might put your hand on your heart as a way to stay connected with your body. This is actually helps you begin the nurturing. Let the hand be very tender, light touch, gentle. And then just ask yourself, how does this part want me to be with it? What does it most need? Does the part need understanding, forgiveness, compassion, love, company? What does it need? To offer nurturing, you might take a few full breaths and sense that you're contacting your most awake experience of heart and mind, your high self, your most bodhisattva awake self. If that's hard to do, you can call on another being. Could be a friend or family member, a pet, teacher, ancestor, spiritual figure. And just sense that you are this being of love and wisdom that you trust, that you're offering inwardly what's needed. That's what's happening right now. To offer inwardly some nurturing. And it might be through words. I'm here, I'm not leaving. Trust your goodness. If there's fear there, you might say, thank you for trying to protect me. I'm okay right now. You might send the message, you're held in love. Just explore what message you can offer or that can be offered through a loving being. And then repeat it with the intention of letting in. Feel that light touch of the hand on the heart. Imagine love, care, really bathing the place of vulnerability. A sincere willingness to let in. And gently let yourself become aware of the quality of presence that's emerged. This is called after the rain, as I mentioned. Is there more spaciousness, a little more tenderness, clarity? Just let yourself inhabit that enlarged quality of presence. Noticing the shift from where you started with maybe the judging self or the bad self or the angry self, the fearful self, to this more spacious field of loving presence. And if you are noticing some new or residual difficulty, offer this your acknowledgement, your care. And as you complete the meditation, you might simply ask yourself, your most awake heart, what it is that might be helpful to remember. What do you want from this that might guide you in the future? If your eyes are closed, you might open them gently, again, taking a few breaths, coming back. And thank you for exploring this with me.
Tara, thank you so much for such a beautiful practice. And I know it's been so helpful to so many people, including myself, and just so poignant and such a sense of shared humanity for me when I practice that we're all in this together. So thank you.
Thank you, Cassie.
I'm curious what you might say to people, including myself and maybe all of us. Sometimes it's either the gap between being stuck to recognize or right after recognize, that there's just that, like, wow, I am so stuck in this circle of thinking that I can't even get to recognize. Or right after recognize, I'm like, okay, there's no way out of this stuckness. Do you have advice for that very beginning part, or how people can make it more likely that sooner in a triggering episode they might remember to rein?
I love that you're asking. I love that question because when we get hijacked, um, we really need to be sympathetic to ourselves. Like, it's not our fault, but our brain is in a different place. We are caught in our kind of limbic reactivity, and we don't have access so much to the executive functioning, the parts of ourselves that would say, okay, just recognize what's here and so on. So the first thing is to be really patient and sympathetic about that.
Mm-hmm.
And consider it a training that we have grooves of neural pathways that we've been using over and over again when we get hijacked, and we're trying to teach our brain to find new pathways of response. And one of the ways of training is before difficult situations, when we know they're a triggering situation, practice ahead of time. Just review it ahead of time as if, because the brain doesn't know the difference. And the brain can begin to learn new patterning if we practice ahead of time. And if you get stuck and you rerun the old reactivities later in the day when you're more resourced, rerun it then. And that's one way to train the brain. And then the other piece is that often it takes a kind of pause where we take a few deep breaths, and in those deep breaths say, I've been here before, I'll be here again, it's okay, but I'm curious, let's see what's happening. And then name it out loud, whatever you're aware of, just start naming things, because the very act of naming starts activating the frontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex. And the last thing I'll say is that beautiful quote, between the stimulus and the response, there's a space. And in that space is our power and our freedom. That's Viktor Frankl. And so we're learning to pause and find that space. And it just takes patience and humility and kindness.
Yeah. And something that often helps me is just to stay with kind of like, ooh, this is a big one. Okay, this is a big one. Like, even saying this is a big wave, I can't really say this is a big wave without some part of me noticing this is a big wave. And sometimes that's the moment for like just a couple of minutes of like, ooh, big one, big one, big one, big one.
It's true. You're already beginning to activate that prefrontal cortex just by saying, whoa.
Yeah, right. Well, something that you said relatively quickly that I think is so important is investigate is mostly or all somatic. Investigate is somatic. And maybe you can expand upon that a little bit, because I definitely think a lot of us can get tempted, or the ego can be like, yay, let's investigate, which to the mind sometimes means rumination. Let's chew on this. That's not really what you mean. So tell me more about the somatic investigate.
Yeah. And thank you for asking that, because it is the single biggest misunderstanding of mindfulness and of RAIN, is that we're in some way trying to come to a mental insight. Investigate, I would say 98% somatic. And that means that we have to feel where the feelings live in our body. And there's a saying that the issues are in the tissues. So it's not until we reconnect with where the issues are in our body, but not just reconnect with a quality of presence and kindness, that they actually start to be processed and transformed.
Thank you. Yeah, really helpful. And I think for our listening audience, just to break it down even further, it really is rather than thinking more about the issue, my heart feels tight, my stomach feels, sinking feeling, my legs feel tight, my head, my hands are clenched. Those kinds of things are different. And um, at the end of the RAIN practice, one of the things you talked about was sort of a loving kindness to ourselves from our higher selves, or a loving kindness from a figure. And one of the things that I work on with my mindfulness students sometimes is one way to recognize that figure is these words are often mostly very short. It's not a very long soliloquy on what's going on with you. It's often like, be patient, wait, it's okay, hold on. These are sort of the level of words that we get, and it's so much more a feeling.
It's a very powerful observation that there are messages that can save us, and they're not mental. They're directed right towards our body and our heart. And really the whole pathway is moving from the trance that's reinforced over and over again by our narrative and our thinking patterns, to move from that into the aliveness and felt sense of the body.
Hmm. I have a question. Is it possible to, this sounds silly, rain on others? Can I sort of, in relationship, sort of say, I recognize you, am curious, I want to nurture.
Yeah, I do a lot of teaching on the rain in relationship. And after you've done rain for your inner life, there you've kind of lit up parts of the brain that are naturally compassionate and empathetic. And so to walk through the steps for me to say, what do I recognize right now that Cassie might be expressing? And
Mm,
just make space for that. And then with curiosity, investigate more. What might that be like? How might that
mm,
feel? Where's the stuckness on that? And then to ask, and this is such a profound question, when we ask ourselves, what do I need right now?
mm,
And for me to say, well, what do you need right now? Asking that, it's like it allows me then to offer something to you that is meaningful and attuned. Now, we
mm,
might not guess right, but the very fact that we're deepening our attention brings us closer to each other. I teach RAIN partners, and on my website you can find instructions for it, and it's such a powerful
mm,
experience to do RAIN with a partner, and be
mm.
able to share what's going on. It wakes us up again from me to we in a very profound way.
That's great. Thank you. I have one last question, and that's just that the purpose of the overall summit is to expand our ideas about mental health and well-being, and to certainly expand our approaches. And RAIN is one of those approaches. But I wondered if you had any thoughts about how we can skillfully advance this idea of empowering people to feel more equipped to work on their own kind of mental well-being, to sort of democratize the idea of mental well-being, that certainly we all need, and most of us need treatment at some point in our lives, or some one of our loved ones does, from a medical professional. But there are tons of other ways that we can elevate our own individual mental well-being, and that of our families and communities. Just any final thoughts about how we can skillfully spread this idea?
Well, I have a couple of thoughts. One is that I'm believe in free access to, universal health care. And I really wish that universal health care would mean that insurance, just the way insurance and government pays for vaccines, that they'd pay for free access to all the yoga and meditation and
Yeah.
exercise and nutritional education and all of that. So but that's not exactly what you're looking for. But I thought I
No,
just
I think it's actually quite important. And, I helped to direct a mindfulness center at UCSD, San Diego. And, medication is covered by insurance. Some psychotherapy is covered by insurance, hospitalization, but a mindfulness class is still to this day not covered by insurance.
There are some insurers that actually have built in, um, for companies and so on, that being part of what they can do, but it's just, that's like tiny, tiny, tiny. So, and that's fantastic I love what you're doing, and I feel like it's going to come through the university mindfulness centers and so on. So that is one, that it become part of the culture. And the other is, it's challenging to self-care is not easy. We all get caught in our busyness. And so the two suggestions for all of us who want to dial in and refine and deepen that self-care, because really our health is probably more dependent on how we sleep, eat, meditate, exercise, etc., than on anything else. Two suggestions. One is to really dedicate to releasing judgment about how well we're doing on that front. I have so many people say, I feel like I'm failing in my exercise, I'm failing in my meditation. So to let go of the judgments about progressing, do it because you love life. If there's a New Year's resolution, it's really out of love for life, and then just have that aspiration. I do find, it's actually three suggestions, that every day I made a commitment after I gave birth to my son, because my meditation practice started getting wobbly, every day, no matter what. But I had a back door of, it doesn't matter how long. And what that meant was, in those early days, I might be exhausted at the end of the day, but I would just sit down for 3 minutes and I'd breathe, and whatever happened was okay. And I'd say, bless everybody. And then I go to sleep. But that counted. Yeah. And nature loves a rhythm, and just get into the rhythm of pausing. It's a gift to the soul to pause and just pay attention for just even a little while. The last thing I'll say is, it's hard to do things alone, and we get so much value from, I know you know this, from a mindfulness center. There's so much benefit in practicing with others, and form even a group of 3 people, and even if it could be online once a week, it makes a difference. I'm part of something called Cloud Sangha, and you can find it on my website, where people from all over the world get together in small groups and meet, and meditate and talk about how to bring it alive in their life. So we need that kind of support with each other, and it deepens intimacy, it deepens a sense of belonging. So it's beautiful.
Oh, it's so great. Thank you so much for taking the time. And is there a place that people can find you, or is there anything that you in particular want people to know about your work right now?
My website, tarabrach.com, and I hope to encounter those of you listening on the path whenever. So, yeah, thank you, Cassie.
All right.
All
so
blessings.
Great to see you. Have a wonderful new year. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay, blessings.
Bye.